We're delighted to have two very distinguished guests from the world of theatre this evening, David Haig and Nick Starr. I also have my co-conspirator...
Travesty.
What?
I can't believe I didn't make the cut.
Oh, no, you're a co-conspirator, Barney.
Oh, okay.
But I'll come back to you, don't worry. There is a kind of linkage here because David and I were at school together and we were both asked to leave early because we didn't fit in. But we're not going to go there. And the people that did fit in apparently are still there, so that's something of a relief. There's a further sort of fit-in that links us all together, which is the Bridge Theatre. I first met Nick Starr when he and Nick Heitner were running the National Theatre during a period of unprecedented, amazing artistic output. And they moved on and founded the Bridge, where my contribution is to pay for the wonderful art that goes into it. And David is in the process of finishing a play that's going to go in there. Barney was the third play to be put on at the Bridge Theatre. If you haven't been, you should do. There's an amazing Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe that three of us were at on Monday night, which was fantastic. And obviously, Barney and I were at Keble. Nick was at Merton.
And I wasn't.
David wasn't. David has had the most amazing career since school, where sort of acting in a house play was obligatory. And it put some people off, but it didn't deter David. And David has appeared really across all mediums, the theatre in the glory days of the Royal Court, and in an amazing range of films and TV. Most recently, you might have seen him in Killing Eve. You might also have seen him. You will have seen him in Thin Blue Line, an amazing range of television, theatre and film. And so going to start really by asking David how the journey began, how did he get from sort of 1972, 1973 when he and I were sort of playing rugby on damp pitches miles away and getting our knees bloody and our heads kicked in by much larger people. How he got to the theatre, because I know some of the younger people in the audience will be keen to understand how it is still possible to have a career, in Barney's case as a writer, but in David's case as an actor and as a writer. So, David, over to you. Rambling introduction.
No, well, I'll try. Shall I continue in that tradition? No. I suppose I started as a compulsive and pathologically lazy schoolboy. At the age of 11, I was cast as Jocasta in Oedipus Rex, Oedipus's wife and mother, and really never looked back and enjoyed the sort of the centre of attention, but also a sense of self-discipline and enjoying work for the first time in my life. And for somebody who was considered to be congenitally lazy, have become somebody who people perceive me as now as hard-working. And after leaving that school, referred to under an ominous cloud, I then lived abroad for a couple of years and found drama school eventually irresistible, and returned and then launched off into drama school and then subsidised theatre in an era when every town in the country had a subsidised theatre that they were proud of, and that people... It's a classic grumpy old actor cry, actually, but it is pertinent to the sort of work actors get now in these massively streamed television series, where you can disappear into a series that consumes you for 7 or 8 years, if you're lucky, on a channel that has perhaps 1 million or 2 million viewers and actually thrives on commercial grounds rather than the number of people who actually enjoy and see it. Whereas when I started, actually far fewer than 1 million saw it. But these subsidised theatres were the very heart of towns around the country, and you weren't judged either as rapidly or forcefully. You know, you'd get David Haig was quite good in The Winslow Boy by the sort of Western News or some of the Southwestern News. But they were a wonderful part of British society that I think it's very sad we've lost. And then, as you say, got sucked into the royal court and onwards. I mean, I don't want to sort of chronologically
No. I wouldn't dream of that. We're going to leap about anyway. How do you feel having done your King Lear? Because many people leave that until they're old.
Yeah, that was, yes, too young, but I loved the scenes on the heath because there's a sort of a manic side to me which is only ever expressed in theatre. I don't know if that's something to do with actors and actresses being able and allowed to release something that is submerged or camouflaged at home or in their everyday life. But I'd just finished doing The Madness of George III, which I suppose I loved more than any other character I've played. And often, as in Dennis Hawthorne actually played Lear shortly after playing George III, originally at the National, and I think there's a link in that madness that led them to asking me if I'd do it. I'd love to go back to it, yeah.
No, very definitely. But one of the interesting sort of denominators of your career is that you didn't actually get involved with either the National Theatre or the RSC. They're sort of, what would you describe them as? The brand, the heritage
I was an
brands?
accident. I didn't mean to say heritage brands, which sounds very Duchy of Cornwall, but that was sort of what came out of my mouth, yes.
Actually, I was at the RSC for 4 or 5 years on the trot.
Were you carrying spears, or were you?
Initially, I carried spears and was defined as third gentleman several times. But that was also, it's an exciting time to be at the RSC because there really was a sort of central ethos, and people also joined for 2 years to do a selection of plays. They knew they had the carrot of having sort of worked in Stratford, they would get their turn in London, and that was very exciting as an objective. And they believed in the way the work was being done. I think it's more diffused now and more difficult to pinpoint and difficult to persuade actors to actually commit to any length of time like that.
And to go to Stratford, there seems to be a reluctance now. You know, if you go to Stratford, you're kind of out of the London scene.
You are. And if you're keen, desperate to stay within the London scene as a young actor, I think it's not tempting. And that probably diminishes the standard there or the focus there. But as I say before, you had a year in London as the carrot at the end of your year in Stratford. Yeah. Not that it should be seen as a sort of progression or an improvement, but it was certainly appealing.
Did you, when you were beginning, before you began your journey as an actor, and when you were going through your journey as an actor, were there any sort of the older generation? Because I'm very aware that now, you know, we've had Maggie Smith coming back on stage at the Bridge Theatre, and we've had Gandalf doing his 80th birthday show around the country. If you haven't seen it, it's great. Was there any of that generation that you must have worked with them. Is there any particular performances that you remember strongly from that period? I
do remember Hawthorne's King George III. I don't know why I'm harping on that, but it was so sensitively powerful and vulnerable and extraordinarily skillful. I love that. I'm trying to think of any
Did you manage to see Ralph Richardson, for example? I saw him once at the National way later on.
What was the play that Gielgud and Richardson did together? Do you remember? What was that?
Pinter.
It was the original production of
Homecoming?
No.
Yeah, no, just...
No Man's Land. Sorry.
No Man's Land.
Man's Land, that's it.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, that was phenomenal. But
Where do you think these days, because you're at the Royal Court in a very exciting period, where would you say the equivalent of the Royal Court was now? Is it with Barney in Richmond? Is it where is it?
I think maybe. I mean, is it the Young Vic, the Donmar? I don't know. I mean, maybe it's not as, again, focused in one place. You know, I mean, there are so many exciting smaller theatres to go to enjoy.
I think that's a really interesting recent change in the way the theatre ecology works that I found quite strange in terms of setting myself dreams I would like to pursue. Going into the theatre, there were pretty much 4 places worth having a show on in. Really, like, oh, that would be the night. I could walk away if that happened. And that number is now getting up to double figures. And I don't think we'll go lower again. It's not like, I don't know, I think there are many more theatres than used to be. I think the theatre is a less minority pursuit than in the past in terms of attendances and so on. The Court, through its sort of peak George Devine period, the Arts Council stated that it needed to play to 17.5% capacity to keep its grant. And that was often achieved. That might have been me. But the theatre, for all that the narrative around that sort of the legendary history makes it loom large, actually was this very small project. You know, the Hampstead Theatre Club was a theatre club and so on, and it would be impossible to only aspire to the Royal Court, the National, and the Bush now. I think that was my 3. I can't remember anyone else. Yeah. But it would be impossible to reduce your aspirations to that anymore, I think. It's a much bigger world now.
But aren't most of them in London? Everything you're talking about is in London.
My 3 were, yeah.
So when David was talking earlier, I mean, you know, the adaptation of your book that you had at Oxford recently, the Ishiguro play.
Yeah.
I mean, it must have been quite difficult doing a regional tour, given that quite a lot of the theatres, particularly, you know, in the northwest and the northeast, are now dark.
Yeah.
I mean, you want to go on a kind of national tour. I mean, Nick, you've taken organised tours. It must be a hell of a lot more difficult to get a regional tour now than it was 25 years ago.
I think it is, unless the thing you're touring has become a big success. So to take things out of the National Theatre that were sitting, you know, very good productions that were in the ref of the National Theatre, that take them out. I remember doing a Hamlet, very good Hamlet actually, Rory's Kinnear's Hamlet, which Nick Heiner directed. And I think we really struggled to get audiences above 50% in houses like Milton Keynes and so on. And then once something had become established, that I'm not comparing Warhorse with Hamlet, obviously, but I think there's an interesting question of why. It is true there is much more theatre going in London. It has increased by 25% since about 2000, 2001.
The millennium, isn't it? That's sort of blown up in the.
So why would it be? And I really don't know the answer to this. Is it simply that to those who have more is given sort of thing? It's a critical mass thing. The magnetic force of London pulls people in, orientates them, just as you sort of said about Stratford. The carrot was London. And therefore, for things to be successful regionally, they have to be successes in London.
I suppose
why should it not be, if there is something fundamentally appealing and interesting and fundamental primal about watching theatre, which I think there is, why should we be seeing the growth in London and troubles in non-London? I don't know whether anyone's got any ideas for why that would be.
I mean, as you say, Hamlet doesn't necessarily, even a celebrated production like that, doesn't necessarily sell on tour. And it's very strange and elusive what the franchise is that does sell on tour. You know, you think you're onto a very sort of safe play that has done the rounds, and it won't. And whether it's just a lack of money in some of these places. I mean, you go to the Theatre Royal I toured my play Pressure last year before coming to London. We did 8 weeks, and it did very well in most venues. And then we got to the Theatre Royal in Newcastle, and overnight we had no audience.
Which is extraordinary, because Newcastle used to be the big theatre city.
Yeah.
When the RSC played Newcastle, it was extraordinary.
Yeah.
But I think it may not be on the audience side, because broadcasts into cinemas of plays are very successful.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah. So do you think to some extent that steals the audience? Yeah.
No, I don't think so. I think it's about the artists. I think it's about writers and actors and directors.
Well, I think that it's that structural issue of, as you say, about the artists, the writers, the directors, the willingness to work. But I also wonder whether there is a sense that London is a very different country to England, that work that you think will fly can die horribly when you take it out of town, and probably vice versa. You don't get as many opportunities to test it vice versa. But the zeitgeist, which really is a play has to be about now in some way, that means that we need to hire a babysitter and go out and commit time and money that we don't really have, and will it be as good as Netflix? Almost certainly not, unless it's brilliant. And so, and that thing which people need to see, maybe that is difficult to cater for when the entire industry all lives in the same 18 postcodes, and therefore simply doesn't have an opportunity to go, well, what do people want in Eastleigh or wherever? That is a difficult balance to strike, maybe from a...
But no, that's fascinating. And there is so much television now that one wonders the impact that has. And also, on television, you know, you get these extraordinary things that nobody thought Fleabag was going to be a huge success. And now Amazon has bought Phoebe Waller-Bridge for the next 5 years for an eye-watering sum of money. David, I mean, you've done a lot on television. If I pull out the thin blue line, just by chance, is that something that at the time you kind of knew would be the success it was?
No, absolutely not. In fact, it was, although it was in an era when 13 or 14 million watched each week, it was critically slated and enjoyed by huge numbers. And actually, I think there was a sort of innocence to it, that the more you see it, the more it had a sort of anarchic innocence, if that paradox is allowed to exist. But certainly, I didn't recognize it at the time. I just thought, that's my next job.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely.
Isn't that, yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, I think, you know, we live in an era where they're bringing spitting image back, and when we look at the real world, I kind of feel that satire is something that we kind of need more of. How you know, you're a writer and an actor. How do you see the need for satire, and what satirical works have you seen recently that kind of restore your faith?
Well, I don't know about seen, but certainly one of the most exciting experiences was the episodes I did in The Thick of It, which is a supreme form of political satire, I think, and also a fascinating way to work, because what Armando Iannucci does is he has a sort of a posse of 7 or 8 writers in the room from the beginning, and a very loosely structured story and episode, and you read it through, the writers observe, and you improvise the scenes which Armando is least pleased with. So anything that's secure gets put to one side and will be addressed later, but the scenes which he feels aren't functioning well, then you improvise for anything up to an hour and a half with your sort of collegiate group of actors around the action. And then everybody goes away for 2 weeks, and 2 weeks later you have a slightly sturdier script, and everybody comes back, reads it again, improvises the weaker scenes again, and then 2 weeks later it comes back as a really strongly structured script, and that's the one you film. And then when you get to the actual filming, there's a very essential difference from conventional filming, is that the camera follows you and you don't pay lip service to a often stationary camera, which is why they can do anything between 15 and 19 pages a day, because the camera is just meandering around following the action. Actually, for something that seems so spontaneous, the final script after that sort of 6-week progression, the final script is actually very tight. And you do, again, when you're actually filming it, you improvise on camera after filming the set scenes, but really what he's looking for there are those incredibly spontaneous responses that you get in the thick of it. You know, when a character, you cannot believe how naturally a character is just sort of looking at somebody or responding to a line. And that's what he uses the improvisation for. But I love the power of that satire and the wit, and it was very, very fulfilling to do.
But enormous trust you're placing in the director, though.
You are, and I've never worked for Mike Leigh, but I imagine it's a similar sort of paradox between freedom and control. A contradictory sort of, generosity and autocracy that both of those directors maintain in their work.
Fascinating. Killing Eve, a comedy for our time, grotesques. Again, that can't have been something that when you were filming, when it was being filmed, you thought this is going to be a cult hit.
Well, I was far more certain that had a chance than I was with The Thin Blue Line back in the early 90s, certainly. Because I've always loved her sense of humour, and I thought because actually if you analyse the first series of Killing Eve, okay, so you've got a very appealing psychopath in Jodie Comer, but equally, if you take away Phoebe's extraordinarily incisive and lateral wit, you've got a fairly conventional thriller in some ways. And interestingly, in the first series, she wrote the first 4 episodes, and since when other writers have moved in on the script. And I still believe that her wit is absolutely razor sharp in those first few episodes, and that sounds vaguely self-aggrandizing. Actually,
isn't that
because I died
at
episode 3. But I did actually feel that her hand was very strongly on the script in those early ones.
Because Barney and I were trying to describe, an assassin comedy. It's sort of it's a comedy that almost defies genre, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's electric. And then to watch the second series of Fleabag afterwards, where I thought, I thought she actually wrote a very beautifully observed but quite conventional love story. I mean, cloaked it in other stuff, but actually it was just a humane story about an impossible relationship, or one that could never be fulfilled.
Downton Abbey.
Yes.
Were you? But it must have been quite terrifying in a way, knowing that Maggie Smith was going to have some really killer lines, and other people are going to be kind of on the receiving end of those. How does that work when you got sort of the great and the good, and you know they've been loaded with, you know, the killer lines?
Well, it's the challenge of Julian Fellowes being handed a cast of 17 returning characters, or whatever it is, in a 2-hour film, to actually subtly interweave all those storylines without it seeming pat, and without it seeming this happens at the beginning, this is the middle of this character's arc, and that's the end, finish. You know, I mean, it was, I think, challenging. Yeah. And Maggie's lines were, of course, phenomenally witty, but I enjoyed doing it, actually, because being the royal butler, which was my role in this film that you may or may not have seen, meant that I straddled the two worlds. But actually, in the Downton Abbey world, the aristos upstairs never really meet downstairs, because they all film retrospectively at Twickenham Studios, whereas all the aristos are at Highclere earlier on. And so, you know, there are a couple who work in the kitchen in Downton Abbey who've met Maggie Smith once, and then fleetingly, you know, as she sort of swept past them at Highclere. Yeah. But as the butler, I straddled both, and upstairs they play bananagrams, downstairs they sit in very crowded rows in the kitchens, you know, and talk in hushed voices.
But for the people in the audience looking going to the arts, Barney and I were talking earlier and saying that really a career in the arts kind of involves a portfolio of careers, and you've had theatre, films, television, and also writing. Mm. When did the writing begin to become important to you?
In the early 90s, I loved being part of a painting, metaphorically, but I longed to have a little more control over the entity. That was not to be realized ultimately, because one of the first things you have to realize if you're writing a play, as I'm sure you know, Barney, is actually it is an act ultimately of generosity and abandonment, because you hand it over. And actually, I've enjoyed that process. But the initial motive was to construct the painting rather than to be in it. And then I discovered that the balance of acting and writing was very rewarding and made me less frustrated or bored, whatever, by the process of acting. I was more relaxed as an actor, I suppose, and because I had this second stream. Equally, I never think of myself, and I'm not being disingenuous here, I never think of myself as a writer. I think of myself as a vocational actor who is a bit of a fake writer who seems to be occasionally getting away with it, if you know what I mean.
But you never wanted to direct as well, to sort of take control?
I have directed, and I
but
wasn't...
of your own work?
Oh, no, not of my own.
Because that's the ultimate control thing in a way, isn't it?
Yeah,
you
write the theme
write
tune, sing the theme
and then
tune,
direct it so that...
No, I've been in... my first play, My Boy Jack, I was in, and the play I wrote that was on in London last year, Pressure, I was in that too. But I didn't try to be in Pressure. It was a mistake.
Really?
Yeah, and we offered it to the part who is a sort of doer. I don't know if you know the play, but he was the Scottish weather forecaster who persuaded Eisenhower to postpone D-Day by 24 hours, and thereby saved probably between 40 and 70,000 lives. His awareness of the jet stream and modern meteorology was so superior to the American forecasters at the time, and the Americans thought it was going to be a blissfully sunny day on June the 5th. And if this very dour, tenacious Scot hadn't stood his ground, it would have been catastrophic. And then his true genius the following day was to see his charts and notice a storm had slowed down off Newfoundland, and therefore he haired back to Ike and said, look, I told you not to go yesterday. Tomorrow you've got a window of about 8 hours. Anyway, that was a... But we offered it to two famous Scots who, for different reasons, didn't do it. And then they turned to me and said, would you? And I didn't actually recognize myself in it, but I thoroughly enjoyed doing it when I did.
History, quite an important sort of subject for you to mine. I mean,
as a writer, and
yeah,
I'm sure this is very different for you, Barney, but as a writer, I sort of feel safer with dialogue as long as it can be contemporary in some of the issues raised. I feel safer with dialogue that isn't today's dialogue. That's a cowardice on my part, but there's something about it that I can attack the emotions and not feel I'm misrepresenting a strata of modern society.
I'm so interested by that because I don't think it's a cowardice at all. For starters, I think it's extraordinarily difficult to put yourself into cultural moments which you can't walk through to fact check.
Yeah, that's the direct
opposite. I've done one play. I've done two plays set in the past. One was an adaptation, so you take on furniture which is there already. And then I'm just writing a book set in the past, and it has taken... I've been reading books set in Wiltshire in 1910 for 6 years, and I still don't really think I know exactly where spelling, where and whatever. And it's impossible because these people, what did they think? And what did you hum if the Beatles didn't exist yet? And where was... when were roads laid? There is a bit in Edward Thomas's The Icknield Way about the psychological damage of, not damage, but the psychological trauma of tarmac coming into being. But nonetheless, no one wrote about what it would be like for tarmac to turn up. So how do you know what it was like to go on a road where, I find it so frightening, and it's so much easier to go, well, I know my mum, and she said this funny thing, so I'll do a play about that. And that's all but I think that the gesture, because a writer is a generator of metaphors that we can use to think about ourselves. And so if you were going to do that, then picking really pivotal events in the history of human life would be a really good way to do it. I'm just too scared, so I'm really interested you think the opposite.
No, it's fascinating because it's the direct opposite.
Yeah.
Two forms of cowardice.
But what we can all agree on is we're scared,
Radio, David, you've actually done quite a lot of work on radio. Do you think it should be bigger? I mean, podcasts incredibly popular, but live radio, as it were, and the performance of works written for the radio. Do you think that's a dying medium, or?
Well, they're still, I think I'm right in saying, the biggest commissioner of new material in the country, so it can't be entirely dying. But I think it is proportionately reducing now. It's a very satisfying thing to do, not least because you don't have to learn the lines.
So you can do a different play every day.
You do a different play every day if you're asked, yeah. But I don't know. If I'm being really honest, I've always enjoyed doing them more than listening to them afterwards. Okay. There's a sort of escapist camaraderie about being underground at a broadcasting house and doing a play. And it can be a fascinating play, but I never quite, very rarely, sometimes, but very rarely feel it translates quite as successfully when you hear it.
But do you think that most of the stuff that's written on radio simply, it doesn't translate to another medium?
No, because much of it is specifically written for radio.
Yeah.
I suppose it's so subjective, isn't it? Because I know lots of people who love radio drama. I find political debate and ideas and storytelling and that form of radio more potent for me. But there are many, I'm sure, who love radio drama.
You mentioned podcasts, but I mean, is this a sort of medium, an art form that's being kept alive by the BBC?
Well, is it? I mean, I wonder.
And and the sort of the freedom of podcasts actually Total 29 is BBC, but the idea that you could listen to something and the way in which particularly American ones are dramatizing and mixing dramatization and fact feels freer than the radio drama medium, which has always felt to me, it's always been old-fashioned, hasn't it?
I think, yeah.
Hasn't it always been just protected as a...
I think so, in a way, but you feel you're stepping on people's toes by sort of suggesting it, but I do slightly agree. And I don't quite know where... I think podcasts are radio's way of breaking free from those confines, really. And also, podcast is quite interesting because with I don't know about you two as well, but the Brexit podcast is more potent than the visual version of it on television. And I haven't quite identified why, but maybe there's a freedom achievable if you haven't got an audience in front of you. That if you really do have that's what I meant about radio being powerful as an exchange of ideas, because sometimes you can hide away and then really have a conversation. And I think that's what makes that Brexit podcast so powerful, actually. You really do feel you're just sort of leaning in on a conversation that you shouldn't be privy to.
Yeah, no, that's a nice idea. But you've never been tempted to write for radio?
Not yet.
If there's anybody out there. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
What about
Have you, Barney?
Oh, yeah. I'm. In fact, I am. I'm like in the. I mean, that's. Oh, I know all about it. I volunteered to join the scriptwriters panel of the Society of Authors. Now I'm doing the judging, or one of the people who's doing all the judging on the Imerson Award for the. It's all a bit new because I had a play which you saw, Nick, while we're here. My little play in the cupboard in the bush went on the radio, and then I wrote a play for the radio, and I really liked being in the bunker. Yeah. With Sue Brown for 2 days. It was lovely, and that's just great fun. And then that was happy, and so I thought, well, I'll try because this is so interesting. I find the subculture element of radio very, very interesting. Why is this separate little sort of sauna that we could go to after we've been for a swim, and we could work in the radio as well and have a go in there? And it's fascinating. And the thing I'm interested in particularly, so you've been talking about Downton, and the thing that's fascinating about Downton is the potential for deep narrative. So for a callback a decade later, it's really brilliant, and it works so wonderfully, and often it works in dreadful rubbish and soaps and things, but we can still take pleasure in, that's a callback to something from 1998, how brilliant, or The Archers has all of this. But then also in Anthony Pole, or in Edward St Aubyn, or in Sebastian Barry, we have these kind of deep narrative callbacks. And that's possible in telly, where you have an episodic structure where people are referring back to Series 2 and Series 8. But because telly's so expensive, not only one sort of work, but it was what I wanted to say, only one sort of work gets made where there's drama and a man's dead and we've got to get an axe now. And that's sort of not all storytelling. And the theatre is a much broader school. And I think the radio is opening up. Audible, the development of things like Audible is making it possible for long-form narrative podcast drama to happen, which allows for some of the pleasures you get from a telly show like Downton, where we can go, she's still sad about Dan Stevens, even though he's a multimillionaire now and he's absolutely fine. But she's sad about him, so that's nice. And we can take that pleasure into different narrative landscapes. I was just reading Joe White's play Doggerland, which is about working in a petrol station just before Calais, which of course wouldn't get, it might get done as a telly, but the way he's done it, it's lovely and quotidian and humane, and so no one's got an axe, so it wouldn't. And that's lovely that you could do a multi-episode piece about that. Yeah, I think it's great and really exciting. So I quite like the potential of that, but more than anything else, I just find it so interesting that they don't really connect the pieces. It's this really different world, which is odd.
Yeah.
except it's all the same people working in it. But that's like telly and film and theatre. It's all the same people working in it, but they're very different skills, aren't they?
Isn't that just the structure of the industry?
Yeah, probably.
Isn't it about the gatekeepers rather than about the makers?
Which is why you wonder about the BBC's historic monopolisation of the medium, because although the BBC, the structure is that there are many producers who are also the directors of the pieces, soliciting stories, it's passing through one commissioner ultimately, and the history of broadcasting is therefore made by very, very few people. And you get lovely, weird stories like there's only one. Apparently, Enid Blyton was a horrible woman, so we shouldn't lament this too much, but there's only about one recording of her voice because someone in the BBC thought her books were rubbish, so she was never invited on. And there's a single recording she made reading a story in her 70s, shortly before she died, because they eventually relented and thought, look, she's very famous. We really do need to do something. But Enid Blyton never got on the radio because they didn't like her.
I'd love to hear her voice.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
YouTube?
I think so.
This will be on YouTube. David, which novelists do you tend to read and reread? Who do you go
George
back
Eliot.
to? George Eliot.
Absolutely. Quite a recent, I read her at school, but I absolutely adore her humanity and her incisive dissection of society and her feminism and her battle to establish herself as a woman when she was writing. And ironically, actually, as we're on the subject, she is also Phoebe Waller-Bridge's favourite writer, which is, I suppose, if you think about her a bit more closely, is not as surprising as it sounds. And she's fairly determined to write something for television one day about George Eliot.
Well, that would be great. Well, it makes a change for everybody saying Jane Austen. Not that people don't like Jane Austen, but
yeah, I think there's something more exciting and edgy, defined by partly a woman who, and one has to be very careful how one expresses this, but a woman who herself has said many times, nobody found me attractive, physically attractive as a woman, and I had to sort of sonorously and intellectually convince people that I had a value, both as a woman and in a literary sense. And Phoebe was telling me that at school, and you can imagine she's become a very beautiful woman, Phoebe, but at school she didn't feel that at all. She felt quite the opposite.
those of us who read English here, slightly sort of, being given Middlemarch to read in a week and write an essay on, that's a considerable challenge. I think one goes back to it. Nick, thoughts on George Eliot?
No, I don't actually. Sorry.
Well,
nothing interesting to say. That was interesting. Yeah.
Missed it out at Merton, did they? But you know memory of yeah. Isn't that curious? Barney?
I took a bit of Middlemarch for the epigraph to my first book. I think what she stands for is extraordinary and a sort of touchstone. I think you have to read her quite slowly.
The Middlemarch particularly, the language is quite convoluted.
And the joy is in, look at this. This isn't very interesting, and you're going to look at it because it's equally interesting as anything else. So just keep looking. And that's
but honestly,
beautiful.
But you see, a friend of mine, I recommended Mill on the Floss to a friend of mine quite recently who has that, oh, God, no, I read them at school, I couldn't get through them. It was a battle to get through at all. Recently read Mill on the Floss. It is a very accessible novel and a brilliant analysis of childhood. You write beautifully about childhood, and you should try Mill on the Floss.
Yeah, no, I've read. It's a great book, but I think she gives. There are certain people you really have to properly read, and that thing where you sort of, the Woody Allen joke, I took a speed reading course and read War and Peace in 4 days. It's about Russia. And that, you would miss all of, I don't know what, is that why there isn't a really great famous teleadaptation of any George Eliot? Because it's not quite about plot points. It's about
well, I think they do try to. Or the one there was a middle. There was a middle march.
There was a middle march. Yeah. Julie Aubrey.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But I think it does. I think because I always feel she's deeper and to an extent more subversive than Jane Austen. I think television tends to dilute her complexity. So you don't get anything more than a BBC drama or an ITV drama called Middlemarch.
Yeah.
Whereas I'm not going to go on about it. You asked me who my favourite writer was. So.
The other thing that seems to Barney and I to be important in your work, you write a lot of historical subjects, and particularly the first half of the 20th century. Are there any particular books, writers, periods that you go back to? Are there any historians that you whose work you've mined?
Well, only as a byproduct of research. It's been the story on both occasions. I suppose I've always been interested in family loss, and the two plays that I've written that have been more successful than the one dormant and the one less successful have involved family loss and, coincidentally, war. So those are just themes that I think I'm very apolitical as a writer. I don't think I feel a sort of burning urge to politicize as a writer, but I do want to express a certain empathy, humanity, if you like, through a good story, and there's no question that for all the horrific byproducts of warfare, there is a shared humanity can be exposed in that environment, and I suppose in those two plays that's what I've mined to an extent.
Yeah, no, that makes. And if you've got a current historical sort of project that's beginning to germinate?
I have a couple of plays, one of which is sort of close to home, and I shouldn't think I can talk about very openly.
Right.
Would be presumptuous to say what its progress is. But actually I've done 3 drafts of a play that Nick Heitner and Nick commissioned, and we've done a reading of it. The 3rd draft has been read, and usually the response has been encouraging. Now, what about this? Then the next draft, it's encouraging. Now, what about that? And we may be gradually getting there, hopefully. And I've just been commissioned to write, actually, a play based on a short story by Philip Dick, the American short story writer, which I've just started.
That'll be fascinating. Much is made of the fact that your career has spanned 4 decades. If you went back,
that's because I'm 64. I mean, there's nothing magic about having achieved 4 decades.
Some people start their careers a little later.
Oh well, that's true.
I don't think I did anything before the age of 30 that I'd want recorded. How, when you look back, what are the moments that you're most proud of in each of the decades? I mean, not necessarily the most popular thing, but what work do you when you look back, what are the 3 or 4 things that you did sort of through the years that you got most satisfaction out of?
Actually, it's not. That could be a difficult question, but I'm interested that I find it such an easy question to answer. So the first one was in the 2nd series of Alan Bennett's Talking Heads. there are only 2 male characters in the whole series of Talking Heads, and Alan played one in the first series, and I played a paedophile in the second one, a 40-minute monologue about a paedophile who ends up in solitary confinement with a tiny view out of his cell of planes going overhead. One of the most melancholic images I've ever come across. But the challenge of that, not to empathize with, but to strive to understand what his distorted morality was, that he felt he was doing good. You see, that's the thing. That's the challenge as an actor. When you approach a 40-minute monologue and it's a palpable, destructive human being on the surface, you have to sort of find your way in. And I enjoyed the challenge of that and felt that it worked reasonably well, the final product. So I was very proud of that. I was very proud of George III because that was... I could have sort of stopped after that in a way because it seemed to bring together all the elements that I've been sort of, what's the word that doesn't sound immodest, but the best elements of what you're known for, a sort of manic integrity perhaps, or something like that. And so I loved doing that. And then the other really telling was the day that Jenny Topper at the Hampstead Theatre Club said that she was going to put on a play called My Boy Jack, which was my first play. And the drive home from that moment was quite profound because I felt at one with something. Well, it's the truth.
No, but I think, and it must have been the same for you with your first novel, getting that published.
Yeah, although the specific memory is a theatre one, walking away from the bush and back to Notting Hill, and having a yes in your pocket, and sort of not calling anyone yet because that's really great, and in a while you'll tell someone, but this sort of anyone can write a story, and so when one gets chosen to be allowed to tell it, isn't that amazing? I think that's a very special thing.
But Nick, for you, an extraordinary career at the National Theatre, and then this wonderful later flowering at the Bridge. What 2 or 3 things would you want to be remembered for at this stage? I know there's more to come.
I think I'm going to answer slightly different, because I think you were answering an interior question, weren't you, about the things which you...
Yeah.
I suppose.
Yeah. I don't know. I think probably... I'd go pre-national, actually. I used to work for a theatre called the Almeida Theatre.
Yeah.
And I went and joined a couple of people who, Jonathan Kent E. McDermott, and they just had no thought that they couldn't do anything that they wanted to do, and they just had marvellously ambitious, artistically, all sorts of ambitious plans. And we just did a few things there. I think, particularly, I've really enjoyed doing buildings. Making buildings for theatre is something that is incredibly enjoyable, working with architects.
I suppose I can say it. I consider the Bridge Theatre to be the finest theatre that's been built in my lifetime. I think
I couldn't agree more.
Thank you very much.
I think it's brilliant. I think
it's a very elusive thing. I don't know how many of you have been to the Bridge Theatre yet, but it's a very elusive thing to achieve an environment that welcomes and stimulates, like going into that, as the architect has achieved in that foyer.
He has, yeah.
It really is. It's quite something.
The foyer,
quite apart from the auditorium
it has this
itself.
sort of double reveal, doesn't it? Which is really lovely, and is quite event-like because you have to walk down through this. It's like going to football. You get to you see the stadium, and then you go through the turnstile, and then you see the real thing, and both are beautiful moments. And it's not always the case in a theatre that story is told in the same way. The foyer is just a place with waiting happening in it, and you have to get through it. And I think that's a really interesting piece of storytelling that happens in the bridge that takes you out of, because it's very difficult to see a play in. I think it's very hard to see a play in London because it's so horrible to get anywhere, and so you sort of feel so keenly aware of your own mortality because you can't. And then you walk in, and then you're surrounded by, and you know the theatre laugh thing, the sort of jokes that aren't funny that everyone laughs at for the first 10 minutes.
Yeah.
You know, I've just had a croissant. Ha 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 ha, says half the audience. You think, what? He's just had a croissant, that's all. Why is that funny? And all that, and the taking off the clothes of theatre going to get into a play is a very challenging thing to do. And I think there's something quite cleansing about walking down that staircase somehow, because it...
I think you're absolutely right. I think that it makes perfect sense that being put in the right frame of mind to be most receptive, not to have unnecessary discomforts, surely must be a good thing. To be in the right state to receive, and that's what's going on. I think that I often think about what a brilliant person Nicholas Sorota, who ran Tate for so many years now, chairing the Arts Council. And I think one of the things that I boggle at is we did a couple of projects at the Almeida which were turning other buildings into theatres for periods of time, 6 months, and had a real energy that gave the audience and the people who were working in there a real sort of buzz. But we didn't have the thought that they did, that actually if you turn an existing industrial building into a permanent place of art with enormous scale, really done something. And I think that when Tate Modern opened, that has sort of changed everything. And it was a very strategically clever thing to do because it was an institution that doesn't have a world-class collection, but needed to play on that level. And then at a stroke, and I think London needs that for the theatre, actually. And there is a building in London which you could potentially do that kind of thing with. And nowadays, I think what you do...
Which building?
I'll tell you afterwards. But I think these things, these buildings which have provenance, which have a kind of history to them, there's something, it is interesting. And I think theatre can't just happen in any old place.
But I remember working with you on the shed, which we sponsored and you created. And I thought that was sort of extraordinary. And we had this sort of vision that, it was always going to be temporary, but we wanted to have it so that we could literally disassemble it and go around the country doing a tour and having it on sort of cricket pitches in the winter and football pitches in the summer and take theatre to the people. And unfortunately, the material technology wasn't quite up to it. And maybe that'll come again. Maybe new materials science will be able to come up with the materials that will enable us to do that. But, there you created a theatre that within a few months was kind of, everybody was talking about it. It had that kind of almost instant heritage, even though it was very clearly a temporary extra space. That was extraordinary.
And what it had the license to do, therefore, for instance, I think, the perfect being the enemy of the good is such a, perfectibility is such a, that you can get away with in a really good way. It didn't have perfect soundproofing. There was a saxophonist on the South Bank that we used to try and chase down in the river to get, because it didn't have mechanical ventilation, which is great. So I think it would be great to move away from the idea that everything has to be perfectly air-conditioned. and everything it should be comfortable and appropriate. But I think that we're going to find that sustainability is so important, and that we should stop just doing massive building projects for the sake of them, and taking buildings and adjusting them, and I think that's something that will come.
But you know, so the moment you two sat down with me with the vision for the bridge, I bought into it instantly. I think I was the first man to put his money down, because I could see from, you know, and creating that space that actors and writers are going to be comfortable in. And you know, a lot of people now feel the bridge has been around for a long time. And how long have we been out?
2 years.
2 years. Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah.
Wow.
Do you think it's possible to build a new theatre that doesn't have something that misses? This is not a criticism of the bridge. I'm just wondering if
yes,
the
absolutely.
perfect environment is
Yeah,
inherently elusive. Isn't
You
it?
shouldn't aim for it, should
No,
you? Yeah.
no.
Yeah.
No. But no, I think it's a terrific theatre.
I think it's an extraordinary space.
Yeah.
And,
It's very cheap.
As a building?
Huh?
Was it?
Huh?
Is that because there are no flies?
but it's also got
built it in the right materials.
It's also got amazing. Wherever you sit in that theatre, you've got a good view.
Yeah.
Which helps, and
the
it's
chairs.
comfortable. It's bloody comfortable.
Yeah.
It's very good architect.
Yeah. I think that really matters. David, before we throw it open, and I can see Jenny jumping up and down with a question, and she's reminding me that I haven't told you to switch your mobile phones off, and if fire breaks out, we go through there or there, and Jenny's the fire warden. Sorry about that, should have said that at the beginning. The present moment in time, kind of harking back, reminds me of the 1930s with this sort of explosive growth in totalitarianism, nationalism. You know, the brilliant Julius Caesar, you know, picked up on that with Julius Caesar handing out "Make Rome Great Again," you know, baseball caps. Is this something that's mulling inside you as a sort of response to our times, or?
Well, the adaptation I'm doing of this short story is set in the future. Right. And the exciting challenge, I'm not going to say what it is because it's too early, but the exciting challenge is to imagine what the UK is like in 2050, after presumably leaving Europe, after Trump's 1 or 2 terms,
3 or 4.
and also what has happened to the whole scientific concept of neurology, neuroscience, and in this case, what is still in its infancy, neurocriminology, just exactly what it means to be a human being in 2050, this sort of collision of cells and neurons, and why do we actually feel? What is our consciousness? And fortunately, the fabric of this story that it would be based on will allow that sort of investigation. So I think I'm still mulling now, and everybody will have a different vision of what this cataclysmic period in our history, how it's going to evolve in the next 20 years.